Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. Last year, I gave you a review of the Fuji X-mount version of the Viltrox Pro AF 27mm f1.2, and then more recently, I've just reviewed the E-mount version of that lens. One of the things that I actually did as a part of this particular review cycle is I wanted to see how this lens would hold up as a travel option. It is a very, very sweet lens in a lot of ways, but it's also not particularly small or light. And so does it make sense as a lens to travel with? Now, obviously the Pro AF 75mm f1.2 is also optically amazing, but that focal length, which is about 112.5mm equivalent, is really too long for a general purpose lens. So this lens has the opportunity to fit into a very different niche. While that other lens might be considered a more portrait-oriented lens, this could be considered a normal or versatile type lens. With a 40.5mm focal length on Sony, Fuji, or when it comes out later on Nikon Z mount, that APS-C crop factor of 1.5 makes this a slightly wider than normal lens. Now, some people do prefer the 50mm focal length. I actually really like something around here because of the extreme versatility. So is this a lens worthy of consideration for travel? Well, let's take a look at the biggest cons. The biggest cons have to do really with the size itself. Size and weight, if you're wanting to travel light, this is really not going to be your option. It's over 500 grams in weight, and as you can see, it's not super small for an APS-C lens. And so that, I would say, are the really only true negatives to consider as a part of it for travel. But that is counterbalanced by what I consider to be a fairly strong list of pros to consider it, and to consider it even when you're going to travel. First of all, that focal length really is incredibly useful. I find that it works well for portraits, particularly if you're wanting to capture full body portraits. The fact that it has such a fast maximum aperture of f1.2 means that depth of field remains fairly shallow, and so it allows you to get those kinds of shots where your subject seems to be cut out some from the background. I also find this focal length to be really useful for kind of day-to-day things. When you're just shooting in a room, maybe with family or friends, or shooting a night out, the focal length is pretty much perfect for those kinds of settings. Not too wide, but neither too narrow either. I also find it to be useful for shallow depth of field shots, and the fact that we got a little bit better maximum magnification of 0.15 times, while that's far from being anything record-setting, it is enough to be useful. And so you can see in shots like this, you can get a really shallow depth of field and create unique shots as a byproduct. I found that it worked really well as a landscape lens. The fact that it has such high resolution, contrast, and good color means that it delivers a lot of detail in the frame. Even if you have to shoot at large apertures, it remains really useful for that. So that also makes it really great for nighttime photography because you can keep that ISO down. You can even shoot at wider maximum apertures and still get a good shallow depth of field. And finally, I found it useful for city or street type photography as well. Again, it's a great focal length and reasonably discreet, and so it works well for that. As noted, the image quality is stunning, so that is a huge pro there. It has great autofocus, particularly on Sony, where I found that autofocus was fast enough even to track action and able to keep up with things. IAF worked really well. Another pro for this lens over many competing lenses is that it has a very thorough weather sealing. We've got about 13 different seal points, and so that obviously is really, really useful. That huge maximum aperture and thus the resulting depth of field that comes with it allows you to really play with depth of field for framing things or doing creative shots. And I love lenses that have a large maximum aperture for that reason, because it unlocks my ability to shoot visually unique images, things that your eye doesn't actually see. But when you can really delineate a subject, it allows you to do something that your natural vision doesn't. And that kind of stands out to people as being special. One kind of a side note is that it has a very common 67mm front filter thread, meaning it's very likely you'll be able to share filters amongst other lenses. So in summation, I traveled to get away from this, as you can see behind me. And so I traveled with this lens, with a wide-angle prime, and with a telephoto zoom. When I looked back at my assorted images that I took over the course of the trip, I found that I used the Viltrox 27mm f1.2 65% of the time. Almost 2/3 of the shots that I took, I reached for this lens because it was just so useful in so many applications. And I found the combination of sharpness, good flare resistance, shallow depth of field, and accurate autofocus extremely useful. And so for me personally, I think I'm willing to deal with the weight because this lens is just so good and so useful in so many applications. It's also a great value at about $550, though you can use the code Dustin Abbott to get 8% off and to drop that price even further. So I highly recommend this even as a travel option for those who are comfortable with a slightly larger lens. So you've stuck around to the end. Thanks as always for watching. Have a great day and let the light in.